Good idea. Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today, or this evening, I should say. So today we have Dillon Perron, who is the host of Animals at Home, and I guess the instigator of the Animals at Home network. For those that aren't aware, Animals at Home is a reptile-based podcast, though it does cover a few other animals as well, that Dillon started in 2018. 2018. And essentially what it is it's asking all these sort of new and sort of progressive questions about reptile keeping and the reptile industry overall. Now, Dillon's based in Canada, and a lot of this does have an international focus, but there's a lot of sort of interesting nuances that I think are really relevant to us here in Australia, as well as to any international listeners. So yeah, hi Dillon, and welcome to the interview.
Thank you so much. Great intro. I never do intros live like that. You just nailed that in one shot. Nice job.
Well, thank you. Yeah. I've definitely started to master doing stuff off the cuff of these. So
Nice.
It's a pleasure to have you. I was actually saying to Dillon just before we started recording that I started getting and listening to the podcast, I don't know, probably a year and a bit ago, and I've sort of just dropped him odd things here and there on Facebook. It's been really nice to finally get the opportunity to A, chat, and then B, bring him into this interview. Just because I think the podcast and the YouTube show that goes with it is a really good step forward for reptile keeping and reptile keepers overall. There's a lot of like really interesting discussions that happen that I think overall are really going to start leading the community forward in some really proactive decisions. So yeah, Dillon, I guess I'll start off. I've got a few pro forma questions that I've sent to Dillon, everyone. So hopefully they don't seem too rigid, but we're going to try and make it a bit more of a relaxed conversation. But the classic one is going to be, where did your interest in reptile keeping and reptiles overall start? I feel like every interview needs to start with that one.
You got to lay the foundation before you get too far into it. It's weird. I've always had a fascination for animals. I don't ever remember not being obsessed with animals. So that was a huge part of my life. I grew up on a farm. So I live in Canada. There's not a crazy amount of herpetofauna out here. There's, garter snakes and wood frogs and a few things like that. But really for reptiles, garter snakes is it. There's a few, a couple turtle species that I would never really see where I lived. So right from the beginning, I was outside all the time. The classic catching frogs, catching garter snakes, keeping them for a couple of days and letting them go. We have an in-ground pool in my home where I grew up. And so you're constantly scooping frogs out of the pool in the mornings and kind of looking at them. And so that's where it started. I should say that's where I really realized my love for animals. I in sort of school, I wanted to pursue zoology. That's kind of what I always wanted to do, is be a scientist. That's what I would say when I was 10 or 11 years old. Now that didn't end up really panning out. I went to school for something else. So, but then as far as my reptile keeping is concerned, I would say I started keeping reptiles in 2007. And I remember I was always really interested in geckos and things, but I never could see myself owning them. But one day I was in the grocery store and I was at the checkout line, and there was this aisle or this little stand of impulse purchase Venus flytraps, like a carnivorous plant. And I was like, damn, I really want that. That's so cool. So I bought it and I took it home. And then I realized the conditions I live in a very dry climate. You need to have high humidity. So I realized you need to keep this thing in a terrarium or something that's going to maintain humidity. So I started Googling all these different things and learning how to set up this terrarium. And I remember this is like 2007. So the internet was not great back then, but there was this one article at the end. It said, like, once you set up your thing, you might consider adding an animal like a small frog or a lizard. And that's really what set me off. And a few months later, I had my crested gecko, and that's the gecko I still have today behind me. I've had him for 14 years. He was the first one to start it. So that was the story of how I got into reptile keeping.
Well, I think it's a pretty good story, really. I honestly wouldn't have expected it starting with an impulse purchase Venus flytrap. So
very surprising.
No, that's brilliant. I was going to say. And so, yeah, you've got I just looking behind you, I take you've got and from your show, I know you've got the crested gecko, but you've also got a carpet pipe and a few other things, yeah?
Yeah, so I had the crested gecko for I got him in 2007, and it wasn't until 2015 where I got my second reptile. So my crested gecko really acted like the typical pet reptile that you would see from someone that goes to a pet shop. Like, I fed it, I gave it water, obviously, but I didn't do anything crazy. Like, it was in a decent, live plant terrarium, but I didn't focus. I always say, like, I wasn't really involved in the hobby. I just had a reptile. And like the difference being I'm not interacting with other hobbyists. I just had this crested gecko. And then for whatever reason, actually, I think I remember I was actually house sitting somebody's crested gecko. They brought their crested gecko to my place one summer while they were gone, and I realized, oh, I could easily manage 2 geckos. So as soon as I realized that, I was like, I want another one for myself. And then so I got my Madagascar giant day gecko, and then it wasn't long after that where I picked up a couple of boas. So I have 2 Central American boas, a rainbow boa, and then a carpet python, and that's it. I just have 6.
No, I mean, it's good. I mean, that's I think, and we'll probably touch on this a bit later in the interview, but that's a consistent, I guess, theme throughout the podcast and the show is that, and so my step into reptiles was a little different. I watched all the YouTubes. I saw all the, oh, I've got 10,000 snakes. This is easy to manage sort of thing. That's how my attitude was formed initially. I think that's where the flip, as you've sort of talked about, needs to happen where, it's not stamp collecting in many ways. We need to just sort of go, it's fine to have 6. Like, it's not a badge of honor to have, 1,500 reptiles, in a basement sort of thing. It's probably better to have 6. So, it's I think in many ways, like, and from what I gathered from your show personally, you've got a much better grasp on a whole lot of aspects of things than a lot of people that have that many species, from what I've seen particularly, or, individuals, I should say, particularly at least within Australia. There are a lot of people that can have heaps of animals and even some really obscure stuff here and still have no idea how to take care of it properly in what I would call an ethical manner. So yeah, I don't think it's one of those things. And that's a really good aspect of your show, is changing that discussion around numbers to, the quality of how you keep stuff, I guess.
Well, I would say, I mean, I was going down that path of collecting animals in a way, like I bought a couple of snakes, and it wasn't long before my collection went from 1 to 6. That was only maybe a span of like a year and a half or 2 years. So I was going down that collection kind of path, and it happens in the reptile industry all the time, where I think people aren't really aware of what they're doing in a way. You're constantly wanting a new animal to satisfy that urge to want a new animal, and it becomes this ending vicious cycle that you could never get on top of, because you're constantly chasing the next purchase. Where I was just recording a podcast right before this, and we were talking about how when you do increase your level of care and you start focusing more on each individual animal, the cost goes up, and it's going to be more expensive for buying lighting and enclosure and whatnot, and that makes you a little bit more resistant from impulse purchasing animals. So yeah, I pumped the brakes back a few years ago and just thought, okay, 6, I'm going to take what I can now and make these animals' lives better.
And I think that's a really good mindset to have. Like, I've got more than 6 animals, but I'm going through the mindset where I'm collectively, everything I'm upgrading. Like, I don't really do racking or anything like that, but I've kept species where you can't really keep them in bare minimum. If you do that, they're just going to die within the first week. So I had a leg up in that sense, but I'm going through now, like, everything's getting enclosure upgrades, and it's just, I'm finding that so much more rewarding than that, exactly that endless treadmill of, a new species, new species, new species.
Yeah.
There's so much less stress involved in it. Just going through, like, I've gotten rid of some of my bigger animals and moved them on to people that, have better setups for them or are more invested in those particular species, and made the steps to make sure they go to a good home. But it's one of those things where I can now, something I'm really passionate about, instead of having it in a 3-foot tank, I can have it in a 4-foot and really deck it out, and it's got so much more space. It really changes the attitude towards your animals and the hobby overall,
Totally.
But yeah, with that, I guess, is that in some ways what led you into starting the YouTube channel? Like, what was sort of the inception of that whole process and, starting a podcast? Because, it's no small feat, to be honest.
Yeah, well, I actually originally started with basically a blog where I was writing articles, like not really care guides. I was writing, some feeding guides for snakes, and I would do like a few like DIY projects where I would break down into an article. And I was sort of looking to generate a little bit of side income in a passion that I enjoyed. So I thought, okay, I don't mind writing. I thought I would build this website, but I quickly realized I didn't enjoy writing articles that much. It was kind of boring. And so as I was doing these DIY articles, I would start doing the projects and I would film them, and then I put those on YouTube. So that's kind of how it started. That's how I got into YouTube, was doing these projects. And I did that for probably 6 months, where I just do a few different things, different enclosure build here, whatever. And eventually I hit the point that I think many people on YouTube hit, where you realize it's hard to produce content unless you're constantly having an influx of animals, because a new animal gives you the unboxing, the care guide, the setup, the update, and it's sort of like a fountain of youth if you continuously get new animals. And I was not willing to do that at all, because I lived in an apartment. It wouldn't work spatially or logistically, but also financially, it made no sense to continuously do this. And so that's a dilemma that I see quite often people fall into on YouTube, because they're just constantly starved for content. So that's what led me to doing video interviews. I thought, oh, I would have experts on. Like I said, I only have 6 animals. I don't have a wide berth of expertise. So I thought I could have people on and learn from them. And then I realized, a podcast is really a better platform for that. So that's how it ended up on YouTube and in just an audio version of the podcast. But I would say, as I was going through this process of realizing, okay, that's where I want my content to head, I was also contending with the question of whether or not it's even ethical to keep these animals in captivity. Like, I think most keepers go through that at some point, where I remember finding this quote, and I say it all the time because it really has impacted me. The quote, I have no clue where it came from. I found it on a forum. And the quote was basically, the better the care, the more your animal will reward you with their fascinating natural behaviors. So when I read that, I'm like, that's so true. So really the goal here is to continuously try to replicate their natural environment. But the problem with that line of reasoning is, if you continue to walk down that path, you end up in the wild, and you end up thinking, should they even be in a box in my room, or should they just be in the wild? I know that being in the wild is not, it's not a nirvana. There's predators and parasites and starvation, but being in captivity is a sacrifice of freedom. And that's a massive, massive sacrifice. And I realized we need to, the question is, can we even justify that? So that was really where I started with the podcast, is like, we need to start exploring these questions with other keepers and breeders and the hobby in general. Is there answers to those questions? Can we justify keeping in captivity? And now I think that I can. I have several answers to that question, but at the time I wasn't sure. So that's kind of how the podcast started. And really, I think what makes the podcast maybe a little more unique is it's not so much about the animals, it's more about the keeper. What can you do as a keeper to be better? What can we do to progress the hobby forward and make sure our animals' welfare is increasing, and making sure that people who aren't reptile keepers look at the hobby and go, wow, those individuals are so interesting. They have such a unique hobby. They clearly care for their animals. They're doing some science in the background. How do we make it so that can be the case? And so yeah, that was kind of the starting of it. And like I said, I think that's what makes it a little bit different, is it gives the keepers some tools that they can leave with, that what they can change to make their animals better, rather than sort of listing out specific care sheets for species, which is nothing wrong with that, but that's just not what my podcast is.
No, I think that's a really good way of highlighting probably what actually hooked me in your podcast, to be honest. Like, I still listen to those podcasts where it is literally that basically a care sheet converted into, an hour podcast. But the thing is that particularly for, and again, an Australian listener, there's only so much that's interesting. Occasionally they'll tackle Australian species because they are, so widespread over in the, international trade, generally speaking. So carpet pythons, a bunch of the Agonia skinks, knobtail geckos, the list goes on. But, and it's interesting hearing other people's perspectives on them, but there's only so much of that. And in many ways as well, there's a lot of things, the Australian keeping style and the American keeping style overall in particular, and even the European keeping style, it all clashes. Everyone's got different attitudes. And so there's some things I hear on particularly American podcasts, I'm like, I wouldn't be caught doing that to an animal of that species. But it's one of those things where it just becomes so monotonous. All those podcasts are the exact same in many ways. And it's like, oh, another one on the rung. And it's quite easy for me in particular to just go, I don't really want to listen to this week's episode. My hour and a half of time is better spent, listening to an audiobook in the car or something,
Yeah.
While your podcast, there's, in all seriousness, there's probably like 2 episodes I've ever skipped, which not anything bad against those episodes, just they weren't in my interest. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. But everything ones I've missed by accident, I've gone back and listened to. So and I think you exactly hit the head on the nail there, where you're talking to the keepers, getting the experience of those people in not just a species care sheet, but like their overall attitude towards keeping and the environment that they're in. And I think that's a really good thing, particularly, and I'm sure we'll touch on this later as well, in this day and age, particularly with, I guess, animal welfare concerns, depending on what perspective they're coming from, it can be quite sinister, especially when, the current online presentation of reptile keeping is these industrial racking setups. So yeah, it's one of those things that I think having this attitude change and bringing that more human element to it is really, really beneficial.
Well, it was very obvious to me when I was just starting is that I couldn't identify a guiding philosophy that sort of directed the hobby. It just seemed like we were scattered everywhere. Everybody had a different focus. And I'm not saying we all should have the same laser focus as one unit, but it didn't seem like people were, it seemed like there was no backing of information guiding what they were going to do next in the hobby. It was just sort of grab, grab, grab. And it was, you know, yes, you get to own, it is a right to own your reptiles, but really it is more of a privilege. So if we want to keep the privilege, we need to have some sort of guiding philosophy that we can stand on and help us move forward, or else how do you make a right or left turn if you have no idea where you're going? It's very confusing. So that was sort of, you know, how the podcast is starting to come together. And I think that's why it does resonate with the keepers so much.
I was gonna say, you actually, like, just in saying that, you made me think of it in part with that treadmill as well. I think a very big guiding philosophy for a lot of people in any aspect of reptile keeping or animal keeping is that treadmill of getting the next species. And we see it all the time here in Australia, and I'm sure it happens overseas. They call like the cycle, where something will be really popular, it'll boom up, and then suddenly everyone's got it and no one will care about it. It'll start decreasing again. And then suddenly, oh, they're really rare. Oh, wow. And they start booming up again. And it's just this artificial circle that, you know, and that's what guides a lot of people's interest in certain species. And it really is just the breeding aspect of it in many ways. Like, it's rather than like, I'm going to set this species up really well, you know, I'm going to enjoy it, I'm going to like really, really be focused on it. A lot of those species that have, in my opinion, inherent value as great captive animals lose it because they're not part of this cycle.
Yeah.
And I think you're right in saying that we need to shift that to a more guiding philosophy about, well, this is the attitude we should have towards keeping things and our response to it.
Because it is really just human nature. We as humans like to collect things. And I think there's a whole section of society clearly that likes to interact with animals and nature. I like, in my little mind of a soft theory that I have is that, you know, what makes our species very successful had a lot to do with our ability to use animals, right? Like beasts of burden, ox and cattle and horses. So there must have been a section of society that was interested in doing that, right? You know, you had to have somebody working with these animals and domesticating things. So I think there clearly a huge part of the human population likes to be with animals, and that's what gets you into the hobby. But if you're not paying attention, you will get into the collector mindset without realizing it, because we also like to collect stuff. That's also human nature, having protection, having lots of food, having stuff around us. And if you're not paying attention to your own actions, you can actually be digging your own self into a big hole while thinking you're enjoying the hobby, but really you're just enjoying the purchase of an animal and slowly adding more bills and more vet bills and putting yourself deeper and deeper. So it's about sort of harnessing human nature and redirecting it.
No, absolutely. And yeah, you're absolutely, I've never thought of it that way, but you know, the agricultural revolution had to start with someone's interest in animals.
I assume so.
You know, it's quite a fundamental basic of it. Hey. So I guess my next question going forward a bit is, I know a lot of people talk about, and I've spoken to a few friends here that have YouTube channels, and not necessarily podcasts, but mainly YouTube channels. And it's one of those things where a lot of people are like, oh, I'm going to start a YouTube. Oh, I'm going to start a podcast. You know, it'll be a great little side hustle. I get to talk about my animals. And they fail to realize initially what really goes into it. So I guess the time component, so how much time you've got to invest into setting it up, the mental energy. So I'm a big believer in the mental energy of things, you know, as in like it takes so much mental energy to actually accept and, you know, do a task. So there's a lot involved in that. And then also the financial component. So I was just kind of wondering, now without going into the nitty gritty, what actually goes into your podcast in, I guess, those three regards? Like, you know, is there a lot of upfront money you've put in? What sort of time do you put in per week? And like, you know, what is the actual commitment you make into building a podcast into something successful, and a YouTube channel, I should say?
Well, yeah, I would say the commitment is great because, you know, a huge part of the commitment is just consistency. And I had to essentially run a podcast for like a year and a half with a few listeners, basically, right? Like I always say, you're essentially playing to an empty room in a lot of ways, where you're just sort of pretending to go through the motion. You're not even pretending, you are going through the motions. You're pretending that there's a massive audience there, and you have to do that for a long time to grow your audience. You can't just start with a massive audience. So I mean, we are 2021, and really I started in 2018. So that's like 2 full years and a little bit more of me just like grinding, getting several episodes out a month. So that's the first commitment, is like, if you want success in a podcast, it doesn't happen in a month. You got to say, I hope to have success in a year and a half or 2 years or over, you know. So that's one thing. Time wise, I would say I spend probably between 6 and 10 hours per episode, depending on you know how much editing is required. So the podcast itself takes me 2 hours to record normally with the guest, and usually there's an hour or two prep beforehand. Editing is going to be 2, 3, 4 hours sometimes, and then writing show notes and doing thumbnails and all that. So that is a chunk of time every single week that must go. I don't do a ton of videos. I probably do like 1 video a month type thing. That's not the podcast. And those aren't super time consuming, but they still do take time. It is time consuming. And then, yeah, there's money involved for sure. Like, luckily I just use my iPhone for filming anything, because I don't do crazy filming. So the iPhone cameras are unbelievable. And most smartphones have just such good cameras. So if you have a smartphone, you could easily do it. But the podcast equipment is easily like $1,000 I've spent or more. I spent a couple $100, probably $300 a year at least, just hosting the podcast. Like, you don't just get to upload it for free. I pay $20 a month US just to make sure that the content is available. So it is like a never-ending bill. And I would say just now it's starting to pay for itself. So
brilliant. I mean, like, sorry it's taken so long, but it's good when like something like that's finally reached self-sustaining levels, you know?
Exactly. Yeah. So now I'm at that point, which is great, but I had to kind of ignore the fact that I was spending this money and doing all that, spending tons of time. Like, that does not include my time. As if I was to pay myself for the time, then I'd be, I'd be in the hole like crazy. But yeah, so it is a massive commitment, but I enjoy it. And you're right, it is mental energy and everything, but it is something that I am passionate about, and I enjoy getting better at it. And so that's been kind of pushing me this whole time.
No, well, I mean, that's a great attitude to have towards it, to be honest. Like, I think it's one of those things, and like, I hear so many people wanting to sort of start it, and there's nothing wrong, but definitely making sure that you've got that right niche, and then you're prepared for everything that's going to be involved. Because we'll get onto this in a bit, because it's, as you know, one of the later questions, but that consistency aspect is probably in many ways almost the downfall of the modern online reptile keeping, because consistency requires frequent content requires unboxings. Oh no, my retic bit me. Oh no, you know, like all that sort of stuff. Like, you eventually start scraping the bottom of the barrel. Instead of having genuinely good content, it becomes clickbaity crap, and that is going to be the downfall of everyone.
Yes. Well, and the podcast has really saved me from that, because I'm going to have consistent content that's not me having to like come up with a crazy concept video idea. I get to talk to these wonderful people. They come on, and really my job is just sort of steering the content, but I don't have to create something every single week. And that was really my main focus from the beginning, is making sure the content was the highest quality I was capable of doing at that time. I refuse to listen to any of my episodes before like number 50 because it is, I just cringe. Like, my ability to have a conversation has improved so much, and my ability to edit audio has really increased over the last, especially probably the last year or so. But even when I was just starting out, it was like, I'm going to make sure this is as good as possible, making sure that I'm prepared for the interviews and that the conversations don't tilt off into some strange direction that I didn't intend. Like, I really wanted the listeners to take something from every episode and have value there. And like we were saying kind of before we started, is that you don't get a lot of value out of just hearing people riff back and forth. It can be entertaining, but you don't get to leave with, what am I going to do better now? And so that was sort of one of my main tiers of focus.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with you. Like, I was, again, we're talking about it beforehand, I was listening to one of the older episodes I hadn't quite caught up with. I apologize, I can't remember the person's name, but it was a reptile pet shop owner in the UK. And they were talking about this new system they built with using a Raspberry Pi to simulate like a thunderstorm and all that sort of content. And, it's one of those things. There was a zoo down here in Australia that did something similar with a really cool frog species that a lot of people really, really love. They're called Holy Cross frogs, and they're not in captivity really. This is probably the only place with them still. They were at one point, but they're very hard to breed, and so they're not really around. But these guys successfully bred them doing something like that. They built this this artificial storm system, and they did this really cool promotional video about it. And it was just cool seeing that they sort of pushed forward and done all these added things. Like they tried rain chambers and stuff like that, but they'd done this artificial system. And when I listened to that on this podcast from someone over in the UK who's starting to go down a similar sort of pathway, but in a private hobbyist sense, it just made me go, oh, so many people can get these ideas. Raspberry Pi, I didn't even think of that, working that into your enclosure, building in that complexity, like you're right, it does leave you with something that you can take away and go, I'm going to implement that, like it's, even if it's something small. And I mean, Raspberry Pi is probably a bit of a step forward for most people, but like, just the idea of going forward and progressing rather than having that riff. So yeah, I guess my next question is going to be, or are you there, Dillon? Oh no. Is it still working? Hello? Awkward. Hey.
We're back.
Yeah. I hope it's not me. I'm on mobile internet, but I was like, oh, I hope it's not my internet dropping out.
Yeah, I don't know. It could have been mine. I'm not sure. But I think you ended on a full sentence, so it should be easy.
Oh, good. Perfect. I can cut that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so other than that, I guess leading on from that, what's your thoughts on if someone was going to start this sort of content now, like a podcast, a YouTube, some sort of social media, enterprise for reptile keeping? What are your thoughts on, like, I know a lot of people I've spoken to think that the market's probably oversaturated with it now. And your podcast kind of showed to me, at least, that there's still a good niche for something interesting. What do you think, if someone was going to start this, is it oversaturated, or do they need to find a unique niche like yours to sort of go forwards? Like, how do you view that? Like,
well, I think for sure a niche is really key, because it gives you, the creator, a focus, so you know what you're doing, as you're producing content. I would never say it's saturated, because the internet is so vast. We have such a huge amount of people on the internet, and it's not like the old days where TV only had, a certain time slots every night. Like, I don't know, maybe on a normal week you have maybe 20 different shows that can happen in the evening over the 5 days of the weekdays. Now there's just unlimited. People can listen to content and absorb content at any point in the day, at any time. So really, anybody can start something. But I would say a niche is really key. And if you want to go after something very broadly, it's going to be tough to find people to get interested in it. And then I would say the second piece is the quality of the content needs to be there, because, and it doesn't mean that you need to go spend $10,000 on a microphone. It just means, again, having that focus, because the great thing about a podcast or YouTube is anybody can start one. But the bad thing about podcasting and YouTubing is anybody can start one. So, you end up with a lot of bad content. I'm not talking about just reptiles, but I'm talking about in general, overall, we have, most YouTube channels will never see the light of day because, they're just not good content. So have a focus, have a niche that you want to go after, and then focus on quality. And I would say, yes, there can always be more things to be added to the reptile, to herpetoculture in general, because everybody has different experiences. I'm sure we could learn a lot from somebody that has that focus, but trying to do something kind of on a whim with 2 microphones and your buddy to chat with, I can't see that taking off, because I would say it is maybe saturated in that domain.
No, I absolutely agree. Yeah, I think, you're right. Like the niche aspect of it is going to be the biggest thing, is like refining it into something that's going to be useful and I guess insightful for the community, so they can grow even beyond obviously reptiles, I guess. I guess leading on from that, and I know we've sort of alluded to it a few times already, probably the past 10 years, PetTube and YouTube has just exploded. Not necessarily in that saturation aspect, but just the number of people doing various things, not just in reptile keeping, like overseas, there are people that are like, bird pet tubers, exotic mammal pet tubers. It's huge. And I think something you consistently highlight throughout the podcast is how the YouTube algorithm and how that monetizes videos has ultimately shaped the direction of that growth in sort of the YouTube content. With things like, as I've said previously, clickbaity videos, all these things that generate interest. And I wonder, from your perspective, how do you think that sort of algorithm and that shaping of modern herpetoculture is impacted everyday keepers, like people that keep stuff at home? Because I think that's a big aspect of people getting impacted, as well as people at a hobbyist, or even, again, we don't really have them here, but commercial level as well. Like at those three sort of tiers, because the worst impacted, I think, are the people that have a single pet that come out with this idea of, I can house my single snake in a rack, but like, why the hell would you do that? If you got one snake, what's the point? Versus people that see the large scale commercial, they're like, oh, I need at least 400 racks to be, validated as a keeper.
Well, it's a really good question. And just so people can kind of get a grasp on where I sit or how I visualize the algorithm on YouTube is designed to promote entertainment. And that's what we need to remember with YouTube is it is an entertainment platform. There are people on there that provide information, but it's not primarily for that. And the algorithm really plucks out those entertainment factors. So you cannot expect content that has really good quality information to sort of rise to the top of the YouTube algorithm, because it just doesn't work that way. And most people aren't on YouTube to watch, an hour-long podcast about how to improve your husbandry. People want to see the reticulated python, just missing somebody's face by an inch when it's being fed a rabbit or something. So inherently the YouTube algorithm is flawed in that sense. And yes, it did create this sort of spike in what we call pet tube, right? Where you have people that are already doing that treadmill effect because they want content and they have, 40 animals in their parents' basement. And I don't necessarily think those people are promoting, I don't think people are watching those videos and going, okay, I can have 40 animals in my parents' basement. But what happens is those people have way too many animals to care for them properly. And they insist on going through horrible care guides. So, you're going to watch your pet tuber and they have a whole bunch of different animals, and you're going to get your care information for the leopard gecko that you want from this person that can only, vaguely knows how to care for each animal that they have. So I would say that's the damage on the pet side, is that you have somebody goes to these channels for the care information, and they use this care guide as a piece of concrete written in stone. This is what the pet tuber said. This is how I care for it. When really that's not how you care for a reptile. You care for a reptile by letting it teach you what it wants. You need the skeleton, of course, but after that, it's a growing process. You grow with the animal. You watch that individual animal. What is it like? What is it not like? And that's up to you as the keeper to interact with the animal that way. Pet tubers typically have no concept of that. And I always put the caveat in that there are people with huge channels with tons of animals who I would never consider a pet tuber, because they have really good quality care. They're not going through that, constant cycle. So that's different, but it's the people that are just using the animals almost as exploiting them in a way. And part of me doesn't really fault those individuals who are running those channels as much, because they're almost, I always say, they're sort of a manifestation of the algorithm itself.
Yeah.
They're sort of doing the dance monkey thing where they're just like, this worked, I'm going to do that again. This worked, I'm going to do it again. And they're not even really there. It's just like the algorithm is coming out of them and it's producing content. Because YouTube, the only thing they care about is keeping eyes on the screen to show ads. That is it. That's how they work. So that is something that we want to keep in mind. And so as far as how it's shaped the other sections of the hobby, I think starting on the commercial side, it has made it, in a lot of ways, especially in the States, it's sort of romanticized breeding.
Yes.
And it's made everybody think that they could be a rack breeder and they're going to make tons of money. I wish these breeders on YouTube would show their books. So if you want to show us, if you want to promote running a snake business, show us your accounting books so we can see how much money you're making. Because a lot of times it's just break even in a lot of ways. A lot of times breeders on YouTube make money off of YouTube, not off breeding.
That's been my big thought as well with this influx of YouTube. Clearly, there's a good financial incentive to do it. Like, I'm sure it started off altruistically for some of them to give back, but ultimately, with the way it's been so heavily done, particularly by certain entities, having near daily videos or even, twice weekly, whatever, there's clearly a financial benefit in as well to help support what is a huge collection as well, because they only have so much financial support behind it. And if that's your day job, well, you got to feed things.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think we'll kind of touch on this a little bit later, but that's one of the things that frustrates me, is that that's constantly painted as an option for like a career path, like, you know, set your rack up and go for it, when it's not really fair to the animals, and it's not fair to the people that you're sucking into that world, because now you're going to get them to spend a whole bunch of money and they're not going to make money. I don't have a problem with people breeding, but running a business is not an easy thing. Anybody, but go ask any business owner and say, hey, is this the easiest thing you've ever done? They're going to go, no, this is the hardest thing I've ever done. And I would feel bad for you if you were running a business where your products ate, died, and, you know, needed to be cared for. If I own a shirt company, at least I can throw the shirts in a box and not have to worry about them. But if you are breeding snakes, that's, you know, a huge responsibility. So that's the other side that I see as a massive impact, is this romanticization of setting up a room full of racks and breeding them, when, again, it's entertainment, it's not great information. And then they teach keepers that that's how you care for an animal. And that's not how you care for an animal. That's how you breed a mass amount of animals at an industrial standard. And there might even be better ways to do that. That doesn't really get touched at all. We don't really know. Maybe there's better ways to do that. But instead they go, no, this is actually gold standard care. As long as you have your tub with a paper substrate and a water dish, this is all the snake needs, which is just so wrong and so false. And that's what really drives me nuts, is that a kid can watch that and go, oh, I can get my first ball python as long as I have a tub. Like you said, why would anybody do that? Well, they do that because they see, you know, bar checks say that that's totally fine, and it's not. And so that's definitely frustrating. Although he's changed his tune lately, so I don't want to throw him under the bus too hard.
No, I agree. I think he's, for anyone that's been involved, I guess the broader side of things, you know, there was a big backlash against him probably 3 or 4 years ago. And he started taking a lot of feedback on, and he's, I think, making some pretty progressive changes. Like, at least from what I've seen, I don't follow him, and I don't want to bash him either. But, like, you know, he's changing what he's doing and trying to do some really positive stuff from where he was. And obviously, with how many snakes he has, it's going to take time and money. You know, like for instance, when we got T5 tubes available in Australia, I moved a lot of my private animals over onto them, but I didn't do it instantly. Like, it's T5s here are like $200 each, like for the tube, the fitting and the light. Like, it's money. That's a lot of money to start transitioning everything across with, and time, you know. So I can appreciate that aspect of it. One thing you made me think of just when you were mentioning the commercial side of things, and something that actually was one of my favorite things that's ever come out of your podcast, because I've always thought this, but I've never worded it the way it was your interview with Tom Crutchfield, where he called morph breeding a pyramid scheme. And I always thought of it, I always like, you know, it's always like that. Everyone, particularly, I guess I see it in the overseas ball python market. Everyone's breeding these morphs to sell to other people, to breed these morphs, to then breed these morphs to make money. Like, it's your biggest market is the person directly under you. It's not the pet keeper. You know, eventually it'll get down there, but it's like this. It is a pyramid scheme. Like, the idea is that, oh, if I buy the $3,000 ball python and breed 10 babies, I can then sell them for $2,500. And, you know, it progresses on. And sure, there's probably people that are making money on that, undoubtedly. But, like, it is this artificially generated market where, and this is another thing you touch on regularly, is all that frass on the side, all the crap that people don't want. You know, it goes to crappy homes, it gets fed to king cobras, like, you know, people, and maybe, I mean, the king cobra side of things, maybe that's a more ethical argument than just mass producing and, you know, going to a home that's going to keep it in a tub with no heat, you know, because someone on YouTube has shown them that. And I see that here in Australia all the time. A lot of people that are brand new to reptile keeping will watch all this online YouTube content from particularly the States and go, oh, I'd like to buy a ball python. And then you have to explain to them, no, you can't keep a ball python. They're illegal here. And they're like, oh, really? And it's like, oh, but they're so easy. Why won't they let them in? And, you know, it's just this mindset that they've already been sold. And that's what I view a lot of these YouTube channels are, as marketing. You know, they're marketing their product.
Exactly.
And so, you know, so many people here want corn snakes and ball pythons and leopard geckos, not just on the fundamental basis of that animal, but because it's been marketed to them as the beginner pet that's good to go, that requires very little investment. And that's what they want for their kid, themselves, whatever. And, you know, unfortunately in Australia here, we don't have really any species that correspond that loosely to those lizards in particular. And so, you know, you've got to walk them through. Thank God that, you know, it's not as easy as what the reptile YouTuber has said. You know, keeping a knobtail gecko, they're a bit more finicky. You know, you can't just handle them every day. You know, they're going to need heat, like blah, blah, blah. So we've kind of got a benefit there because we don't have that experience. But it is so crazy seeing all these people in Australia just off the bat ready to have a ball python, like wanting a ball python because they've been sold the idea of an easy pet.
Yeah. Well, you guys are thankfully sheltered from a lot of the morph side. Obviously, there are still morphs in Australia with some of the species, but the ball python thing is crazy. And it's so true. It is a pyramid scheme. It's like anybody listening to this, go Google the greater fool economy. There's a Wikipedia page you'll pop up. That is exactly what morph breeding is. All your customer is the next greatest fool, the person that you can fool into buying it at the price that you need to sell it at. There is no additional value in a morph. And there's this great quote from Warren Buffett, who's this rich investor, and he says, make sure I don't mess this up, the price is what you pay, but the value is what you get. And that's what people forget when they buy the ball python morph for $15,000, and they're totally flabbergasted that by next year it's worth $5,000 because 10 other people have it as well, and they're breeding it. Now there's extras. It's just like, it is very frustrating. And the worst part about it is there's two bad parts about it. One is the perpetuation of morphs that are clearly unhealthy. And then the second piece is the byproduct. Like you say, you have all this extra waste. And as we produce more morphs, last year's rare morph is now the waste. And now we have to deal with it. These are animals that live for 50 years. So it's a serious problem. And not to mention that most ball python morphs fade as they grow. So we're not only like fetishizing the color, but it's also just focusing on the baby of the ball python, cutting the egg and looking at how brilliant it looks when it comes out of the egg. Show me those morphs when they're 10. Nobody wants to because it doesn't look as good. And it's totally pointless.
No, it's a big aspect we have here because there's the two sort of intro level snakes. Sort of one group of them get better with age and they look so much better as they age up, generally speaking, there's exceptions. And then the other one look phenomenal as babies, like for the blonde variety, they're like fluorescent gold and, stunning, but they just look crap as adults, 90% of them. And people get suckered into buying these fluorescent little snakes. And then, 18 months down the line, it's just turned into a dirt brown. And they're like, oh, I don't, I'm unhappy with this now, So it's one of those things. Exactly. I agree with you entirely that we have, and fetishizing is a great way to describe it. Like it is, it's like this fetish of like, oh yeah, I want that, black and white stormtrooper or something,
Exactly.
So, yeah.
And I'll say, like, I don't necessarily have an outright problem with morphs. I don't throw morphs all the way into the basket of horrible things that the hobby does. There are some okay things. Like I get that. I don't think you could ever stop morphs from happening. Like just, variation when you breed, it's going to pop up. And, you're talking about different localities. Like a locality of an animal is all basically just a morph. You're dealing with a different color. So you can't necessarily say all of it's bad. And I get some of the morphs do look really cool, but it's unchecked. That's the problem. It's just like, people are going crazy with it, and they're producing animals that have serious deformations or malformations, and we don't care because we're on the hunt for the next thing. They're like, oh well, this jaw is all messed up, but maybe if I mix it with another morph, it'll get rid of the jaw issue. It's like, no, that's where you stop and you realize you're actually affecting the welfare of an animal that's going to live 25, 30, 40 years. And so I think we do need to put some checks and balances in place in that side.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, like you just talking the checks and balances side, particularly a few years ago here in Australia, the Dunner bearded dragon morph became available through the magical means that all these morphs in Australia always appear available. But as soon as it came up for public sale, the people that had them were just breeding them willy-nilly, relentlessly. Like, they probably got like one adult male and put it over like 5 or 6 females for the whole season, 300, like, from the start of the season, these animals started at $1,500 and they ended at $150, with most people just giving them away. And we're talking one season, like 4 months, 5 months. And it was disgusting because it was just, there were, all these sub-adult bearded dragons. And Australia has a market, like X market, but there were all these animals that had just popped up because people wanted to cash in and frantically trying to find homes for them, And it was one of those things that, and thankfully it blipped and died. And, the thing is that none of them looked good either because it was just trying to cash in on the morph itself. Like it didn't matter what the lizard was. It was just trying to get this morph out there and get, millions of them there so you could make your bank. And it was one of those things I thought was one of the worst things we've had here in recent years relating to morph keeping. Yet, particularly our morph blue tongue market, there are so many people that do really honestly good things with them, trying to progress it forwards and do really nice stuff here as well. It's just, I guess it's like anything, as you've said on the podcast, there's good eggs and bad eggs, and it's
exactly
one of those things that I think, internally we need to develop these checks and balances for the bad eggs, because if we don't, and we know it here in Australia, we do have pretty heavy government oversight on the keeping side of things. And particularly with welfare, it is upping its game. Like we've had recently quite a few pushes by at least my state government to have changes in welfare regulations beyond, you know, there are stuff that needs to get fixed up, but, you know, there's also stuff that's like going too far. For instance, one aspect of it is one of our political parties wanted to legislate welfare codes for breeding crickets and things like that. And you're like, oh, okay, like I'm all for, you know, crushing puppy farms and all that sort of stuff, but like, you know, cricket's a bit like, but anyway.
It's a bit much. Yeah.
So it's one of those things that, you know, and we'll get onto this, I guess, in a bit, is that we need to start self-governing a lot more for these sorts of things, these runaway trains, before they become runaway trains.
Yes.
Otherwise, when it's an like unruly problem, we're going to have something hard crash down on us. I mean, Florida's just seen that with their recent ban. Like I think came out 2 or 3 days ago, they've banned 16 species there permanently. They're giving grandfathering, but I think that'll cripple in many ways a lot of the American pet market, because it's like iguanas and, you know, all the ones bred in the US, I think, are pretty much ranch bred in Florida. Like, you know, it's just going to destroy so much stuff down there, which is possibly a good thing, because, you know, first time keeper probably shouldn't keep an iguana.
Yeah.
From what I've heard, they're not. From what I've heard, a $20 iguana at a pet shop is the worst idea.
Well, a lot of the species on the list are species that shouldn't be in the hands of most keepers anyway. I'm not saying I'm for the ban, but I'm just saying like they're big species, Asian water monitor, rock pythons, and things like that. And it's frustrating when I see that, you know, people, they stand on the hill of it's my rights to keep whatever I want, and you can't tell me what I can do with my animals. And yes, I guess technically that is true depending on where you live, but you also live in a society with other people. And I bet you hope other people in your society don't behave in a fashion that they guide their actions off of, I do what I want. Like when you call the cops, I hope you don't think, hey, hopefully the guy comes, or maybe he doesn't feel like it today, so he's not going to come, or the fire department, or, you know, the electrical company. So we all have to do things within our society to make sure the society still functions. So you can't just stand and say, well, you can't, I can do whatever I want because it's my rights. Yes, it's true. But I think you can only have that position if you don't utilize the society. If you live in the bush and you're totally isolated and you don't have to worry about anything, you do your own, you know, food and power or whatever, then I guess you could hold that position. But if you interact with the society in any way, you at least have to capitulate on a few things to make sure that you're harmonizing with the people around you. And if people are seeing you keep 15-foot reticulated python in an 8-foot enclosure, and it's nose rubbing and it's going back and forth, and there's, you know, feces everywhere, and this paper substrate is crumpled up, and the water dish is dirty, any person that looks like that doesn't know anything about reptiles or knows anything about reptiles is not going to look at that in a positive way. They're going to say, why should you do that? And, you know, in some sense, we are not in some sense, in all sense, it's our responsibility to make sure that we're doing everything we can to make sure that the outside public looks at us positively.
Absolutely. I totally agree, because I always wonder, like as a fun sort of thing within the Australian community, I actually did a poll quiz, Google Forms sort of thing with just a bunch of general questions to see, like, if people answer it anonymously, what they would say about certain things. And one of the questions was, if you weren't a reptile keeper and you saw a rack set up, do you honestly think that's a good thing? And most of them said they could understand from an outside perspective how it would look bad. You know what I mean? Like you're depriving an animal. And, you know, we're all sold the classic, oh, they're nocturnal, oh, they don't move much, oh, the blah, blah, blah. And, you know, all the reasons why racks are justified, or like, you know, justified by those that use them. Not that I'm bashing racks, I like time and place for everything, obviously. But, you know, the big pitch to why I can keep 10,000 snakes in my racks. And it sort of sets up this big discussion point of, well, that's the thing. Most of the people that are involved in the public pressure in our society, the lawmakers, the policymakers, everything like that, ultimately we're a small niche. And when something like that pops up and looks really bad to the everyday punter and someone can get a momentum behind it, it's going to backfire on the community. Like, you know.
Exactly.
And the analogies are being made, we've joked about it here, I guess, in part, but like the analogies made at a bigger scale that, you know, rack breeding in the thousands is akin to puppy farming in many ways, you know, like, and that's a very taboo, like particularly again, my state, they've just set up a task force to nail puppy farming. And, you know, they're raiding properties left, right, and center. You know, like it's becoming a huge move forward because our society has agreed, okay, we're not going to tolerate anything in line with this anymore. And, you know, there are a lot of people that are, from, you know, what I've heard anecdotally and been shared by other people, that are getting caught up in that haven't done anything wrong and getting affected by it. Like not necessarily breached any regulations or rules, but, you know, someone's made a complaint and they've, you know, had a lot of issues and gone in from there. So it's one of those things that, like, it seems, and that's in the puppy context, I should say.
Right.
It's become a very big talk point for a lot of the animal welfare people in New South Wales lately because of that. But it's one of those things where it's like, it's been decided by the society as a whole, and now heavy-handed actions are coming in. So,
Exactly.
and that's because everyone looks at, and I'm not justifying it at all, but, you know, it's one of those things, it is bad, it looks bad, everyone knows it's bad, let's add it, address it. And that will come for rat keeping, I think, one day when there's a big momentum behind it, you know, on scale mass rat keeping at least.
Yeah, I totally agree.
So I guess we sort of touched on it throughout this, but like we've talked about the current perspectives and sort of those changes that are needed. What do you think in regards to particularly welfare, something that's always been neglected or sort of sidelined for a lot of reptiles? What do you think will happen if we don't address those concerns that are starting to get some pretty decent momentum behind them, both within the community and within sort of research into them as to how to fix that up?
Well, the simple answer to that is we'll just lose the privilege to keep them. And,
Yeah.
you know, that when you have the outside general public, if they don't, if they have access to evidence that the welfare standards are low in the hobby, that's pretty much all the ammunition they need. And because it's easy to sell that to anybody, like, hey, these people are keeping these animals and their welfare is low. And unfortunately, a lot of times it is true. So that's what will happen. We'll completely lose the privilege, which would be a big shame, because there are some serious benefits that we gain from being able to privately keep reptiles. And I don't think a lot of people spend time thinking about it, but I'll just run through a few of them really quick so people have these in their mind, you know, to arm themselves against this question. Because at the end of the day, the animal rights groups are going to try to take away pets regardless of your position. That's their goal. So but they don't think about the consequence. Like, okay, if you get rid of all reptile pets, what else are you getting rid of with that? Like, are you throwing the baby out with the bathwater? So there's a few great positives. The first is you're introducing people to wildlife. A lot of times people are interacting with nature on a captive animal, whether that's at the zoo or a private collection. That's a positive experience because you're teaching people about the beauty of nature and the importance of protecting it. And, you know, that's one of the things we do with the podcast is I make donations to Peruvian Amazon rainforest because I want to make sure that we're generating some cash for the wild counterparts. So that's one great thing the hobby does. The second thing is through conservation as well. So I've kind of touched on it there, making donations, but also, you know, captive breeding and assurance colonies and whatnot. And so that's another great thing. Obviously, the hobby is amazing at breeding animals. That's one great thing that the hobby's good at is you have people that tinker with projects at their own home. And a lot of times zoos come to hobbyists and say, hey, can we buy these animals from you? Or how are you getting these animals to breed? And that sort of brings us into another layer is the science. Sometimes the hobby is directly involved with adding to the scientific literature, right? You know, have universities coming to keepers. And I mean, you're involved with the university and you're a private keeper, so you can see that yourself. And then the fourth really important piece is it gives keepers some responsibility and some purpose. And a lot of people really need that. You need something that relies on you so you can wake up in the morning and care for something. And it's really important. So if you were to get rid of reptile keeping entirely, those are some of the things that you would destroy as well without maybe not even realizing it until it's too late. So that's sort of the answer to the question is if we don't fix some of these things and we don't at least show the general public that we're interested in their welfare and increasing and progressing the welfare of the animals, which we should be, you know, it's an easy target to say, let's just, you know, chop it with an axe and get rid of it.
No, absolutely. And I mean, it's one of those things like, it's always been sort of the tenuous thing here in Australia because there's always this, everyone's playing with extremes where I think in many parts the hobby does things that doesn't do it justice here. And then our lawmakers come in and say, look, we're going to clamp down now. You guys have shown us you can't do this, so we're going to do X, Y, Z. And they'll come in over heavy-handed, and then the hobby will respond, well, if you're going to be like that, we're just going to say, screw it, we'll go underground. We won't play by your rules at all. And then that has its own connotations in itself where, you know, people just go, okay, well, we're going to start doing things without, the proper provisions. We're just going to be quiet about it. Like, there's a big issue, particularly around, well, everywhere I think it is, with in states which have licensing for these species, but like our pet species like bearded dragons and carpet pythons, like the pet species, a lot of people don't have those with the proper licensing, which is its own discussion point. But with that, they just keep quiet and don't, do things that they should because of concerns about, like, the legality of their animals. It's not to say the animals are illegally obtained; they're just being held without a license.
Right.
And so it's one of those things where some of them won't go to veterinary care, some of them won't really, deal with people from, like, try and progress forwards. They'll just keep them. They won't get involved. And it becomes this underground world where welfare ultimately will then suffer because the only resource they're going to have is going to YouTube, where they'll then throw everything in a tub because that's what they've learned to do.
Exactly. Like, I am not for government legislating the hobby really at all, because for those exact reasons, you create an underground world where people hide and the animal welfare will actually ironically suffer even more. So that's why, hence the guiding philosophy that the hobby needs. Like, what are ways that we can arm ourselves to make sure that we are a positive for the reptile, for the actual beings that we're keeping in captivity? Like, is there anything positive about that experience? Yes, there are some positives, but if you're not keeping the animal in a high standard of welfare, that individual certainly has no positives. And then you're also, painting a picture of the hobby not being a positive thing in general. So yeah, it is really crucial that we're steering the ship in the right direction.
No, absolutely. And I was just on that, I guess you made me think of sort of like going forward with our next question that we sort of discussed, was that I think one of the ways that you've done a really good job at sort of setting up the podcast with the guests you've chosen is that you've got people from well-respected people from what I would call the traditional hobby. So like Tom Crutchfield, heaps of people respect him quite heavily, but he's also quite progressive from that sort of older generation of the hobby. A lot of people I know from that sort of generation, are in their ways, and that's how they keep, and that's how they want to keep keeping. But Tom's really progressive. Sorry, I'm just getting a call. One sec. Tom's really progressive in the fact that he, advocates that retics need to be in a bigger enclosure. It's like, don't keep them in tiny tubs. He's also really progressive in sort of going, if you can't do it, don't keep it. Like, all these sort of decisions forward. But then you've got all these new people that don't really get given a platform often, because of the fact that they're not the biggest breeder of whatever, but they've got these insights that are just so novel and so interesting for the community. How do you go about choosing your guests first off, and like finding them, and sort of all the decisions that go in there? Like, I think you've tapped into all these people that never get brought into the reptile social sphere publicly. So it's really good to see them sort of get this traction and get this space to advocate what they believe.
Yeah, a lot of the way I get guests now is a lot of them come to me just kind of naturally. Like, either they send me a message, like a lot of times it's people saying, hey, like, really like your show, thanks for doing it. And then I'll kind of look into what they're doing. I go, oh, you'd make a great guest. And like you said, a lot of times I have people on the show who don't have a platform. And so quite often I'll ask someone to come on the show, and that's their first response is like, why would you want me to be on the show? I don't have a big following. Like, I don't care about your following at all. I'm really looking for people who have a different perspective in the hobby. Like you said, it's trying to pulling people from different areas with different expertise, whether that's an exotic vet or a breeder, or, just a keeper, or someone who owns at a pet shop, and someone training snakes like Lori Torini. Like, there's so many different areas of the hobby that we can all bring together. So really, I'm just looking for somebody who has a unique perspective, someone that has, an interesting story. And yeah, I don't care about their platform, or even if they have any social media. Sometimes I have people on the guest who aren't, or as a guest, who don't even have, an Instagram account or a YouTube or whatever, but they have experience, and it's worth kind of pulling those golden nuggets out of their brain. So yeah.
I was gonna say, do you get much like backlash for the people and the sort of thing? Like, as I said, you present a lot of people that don't have a platform and generally present pretty novel stuff. Do you get much backlash for that? Like the attitudes and the sort of discussions? Like, is it with any form of change, humans don't like that, as I'm sure everyone's aware. Like, change is hard. But are you not necessarily backlash, but is there criticisms? Is there the constant banter? Like, I even remember seeing on Advancing Herpetocultural Husbandry recently, someone put up a rap question and it just blew up again in such a group that you'd think, there wouldn't be. And even your debate episode you did with rat keeping versus non-rat keeping, are you getting that sort of backlash on a whole? And do you think it's generating that discussion we need to have?
In some sense, yes. In some sense, I think I need more backlash than I'm getting, because really, the show is sitting in a bit of an echo chamber right now, which is
Yes.
great because, I have awesome people that listen to it. They're really enjoying the content, and those people are progressing their hobby forward with me. Like, I'm not a gold standard carrot by any chance, or by any stretch of the word. We're all growing together, and I love that about the audience that I have. The the only backlash I've ever got is when I've shared bits of it on like a ball python group or a
Yep.
Kluber group that's like a more kind of rack focused. That's the
Yeah.
reactions that I get from those groups is really hilarious. Like, they see me as a clickbait YouTuber who's just producing content willy-nilly. Like, they could not have a more opposite opinion of what I try to produce. So it's really quite interesting. Those are the only times I get that kind of reaction, and it's tough to break into that section of the hobby because they're so resistant to change. And that,
Yes.
that's, I've been doing this for 30 years. If you've been doing this for 30 years and you have never made a change, I am concerned for you, because what that tells me is you've never opened your mind up to realize that you're dealing with a biological being. This is science. If you think that 30 years ago was the right way to do it, name one thing in your life that is the same from 30 years ago. Like, do you still use your VCR? No, there's nothing the same. We're constantly progressing. So those are the people that really hate the show, and they see me as like like an evil kind of character. But so I'm still trying to figure out a way to crack that nut. But I also get a lot of new hobbyists, which I'm super grateful for, because people are finding the show in the process of looking for research. They're finding the show, which is really what I want, because those are the people I want to capture before they get sucked into the, the breeding romanticization, set your rack up and create different morphs. If we can pull them into this and realize there's so much more in the hobby, and you're gonna get so much more out of the hobby and so much more purpose and fulfillment if you're caring for the animals this way, by increasing welfare, replicating nature and whatnot. I mean, it's easy to get them once they start listening to that message. So I'm still trying to get into the people that are, set in their ways. It's a little bit tricky. Some have moved over, but very few.
I was gonna say, I think you make a really good point there. Like, I guess with everything, especially in this world of social media, there is an echo chamber, and it's one of those things that, like, I find it really funny, again, in Australia, because it's my context. So many people in like the breeding side and the hobbyist side just don't understand the single pet keeper, other than what we always pitch, like the hobbyist side to a pet keeper, blue tongue's an easy beginner species, blah, 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 blah. It'll cost you $50 to set it up, blah, like, not necessarily, but you know what I mean? Like, just that sale tactic that we've all been sold and we regurgitate onto someone else, versus when I've seen like real well done pet keeper sort of thing, someone pitches them, this is how you set up a good enclosure, this is what you need to do, give it UV, like off the bat, there's no discussion with UV for something like a blue tongue. People will just be like, look, you need it. People keep them alive without it, but like, come on, let's try and do the right thing by the animal, because they will get issues, and they're known to get issues like spinal kinking and things like that if they're not given those proper resources. And so it becomes this thing as, this is your pet. You're not going to skimp out on a dog, are you? So why would you skimp out on a reptile? And so selling that right attitude towards keeping animals off the bat. And it's so hard. Once that attitude's established, it's so much harder to change than before it's actually laid.
Exactly. Well, and that's the biggest thing is like, yes, it is a big commitment, and it's expensive too. It's not the real quick and dirty job to set up an enclosure. And I've had so many people who have come into the hobby and then set up these just unbelievable enclosures, and their goal is to have like one, maybe two animals. And I do these videos where I go through some enclosures. People will send them to me, and I kind of review, just sort of flip through them. And some of these enclosures are jaw-dropping, and then you find out that it's the first enclosure they've ever set up, and you go, how is that possible? But it's because they're being exposed to the right information, and instead of going to the store to pick out a morph, they're going on Weather Spark and looking at weather patterns for the animal, the location. They're looking for academic papers if they're not a kid. They're looking for academic papers to figure out how these animals thrive in the wild. They're going to iNaturalist and looking at images of them in the wild. They're going, how can I replicate that here? And then they're so grateful for the experience too, which is just amazing. So it's, once you hook them there, it's easy to keep them. But a lot of people are disappointed when they buy an animal and they think it's $100 commitment, and then they find my content, for example, and they go, oh my gosh, I got to spend another $1,000. They're disappointed that the hobby didn't make that clear to them initially.
Yes. Well, I mean, and that's the thing that I know it's a consistent sort of everywhere, but like when you're pitched a $20 to $50 animal, and I guess, our probably market for that are things like bearded dragons and blue tongues. That's realistically what, for a standard wild type for both those species, that's what they fit privately here in Australia, which says we've probably got a bit too much supply. But with those, it's very hard for people to justify veterinary costs on a $50 lizard. In their world of, I only paid $20 for it. While there are people, like I've had $50 lizards. I had a $50, it's a species called Jackie Dragon. I ended up spending about $600 in veterinary bills on it. I'd had it for 5 years at that time. And I was like, well, she needs this work. She needs this work. Let's just do this work. And that's the sort of thing. That was my mindset. But I very much understand people's mindsets when it's a $50 lizard and they go, nah, we'll just let it, like we'll return it to who we got it from, or we'll let it go. Like, I'm not saying I agree with it, but I understand how you get to that mindset. Yes. Especially when you've been sold, this is a $50 lizard, so it doesn't really need that much work, like it's a beginner at $50 because they're everywhere. They're so easy to keep. It dies, buy a new one.
Exactly.
And you're right. The thing is that the opposition to reptile keeping focuses on the individual. It focuses on that individual animal, the welfare state of that animal. And collectively as a hobby, we need to focus more on that too, to understand and counteract that argument from that side.
Totally, yeah.
So I was going to say, we're just getting close to wrapping up now. For anyone that's hopefully been won over and wants to check out the podcast now, what's the video you'd recommend them as a good first one? Obviously, you said you don't want your early stuff hit on too much.
Don't go too far back.
What's a good starting point? What's one that you think will sort of really give someone a good grasp of the podcast?
So I would say if you want a really quick video, we did a sort of a progressing reptile series with myself and a few other channels. So that's not a podcast, it's just a video. And I think the video is called Best Reptile Enclosure. I should probably, maybe I'll send you the link. I'm kind of forgetting what it's called. Best Reptile Setup, I think it might be called. So it talks about how to progress your care. So that gives you like the 6 or 7 minute Cole's notes on sort of my philosophy of how I think about reptile keeping. And then I would say if you go back to a bonus episode that I released on January 1st, 2020, and it's called Is Your Reptile Husbandry Up to Standard? That is just a solo episode with myself. It's just a 30-minute episode. And I just run through, I sort of give an audit on breeding racks, but also I'm not really attacking them. It's more so saying like, these are some areas that we can improve. So I think if someone were to listen to that episode, they would get a really good sense of how I'm approaching the hobby. And that was a year ago now, so maybe I would even disagree with some of the stuff, but it would at least give someone a good foundation. And then after that, then, just pick an episode, and there's quite a few at this point. We're almost getting to, I think, 80 episodes. So there's lots to choose from.
Brilliant. And I guess the sort of open-ended question, where to from here? Like what's the direction for the podcast? What are you hoping to do, say, in the next couple of years? Or next year? Let's go next year. Next couple of years might be a bit hard to predict.
Yeah. I would say, well, one thing that I did change last year was I added another show. I realized, like we talked about how much time and money it takes for me to produce a show. I realized I can only get so much out of myself. So I changed it just from a podcast to more of a network model. So Bryce Broom is a South African venomous keeper, a really great guy. He's, I think, only 19, super smart. And I knew that he could do a good job. So I added him. He has his own show called Animals Everywhere. So if you're flipping through the episodes and you see anything called Animals Everywhere, that's his show. So I don't know if I'm going to add another show within the year, but I'm going to continue that one as well, and as well as my show. And we've also added these roundtable discussions, which people really love. That's bringing a couple guests on at once, and we just pick like 1 or 2 topics and just kind of go at it and sort of try to carve out some new territory in herpetoculture. And then there's roast sessions as well, which is just episodes between Bryce and I that because we're both the hosts of a podcast, we don't talk about our own personal hobby very much. So that gives us an opportunity to kind of go back and forth to figure out what each other are doing, new animals and whatnot. So anyway, this is a long-winded version of your question. My goal really this year is to just grow the listenership. And we've been doing really well the last probably 4 months. It's been growing. I think this month we'll probably hit almost 20,000 listeners in the month.
That's brilliant.
Which is awesome. Yeah, I'm super excited about that. And about half is from YouTube and half is from audio podcasting apps. I want that to grow because I think there's You know, you look at a channel like Snake Discovery, for example, and they're pulling in like 400,000 views on a video. Now, are all those 400,000 going to listen to the podcast? No way. But maybe 1%, maybe there's 4,000 people in there that would get something from the podcast. So I know for sure there's a huge audience out there that we're not in their ears yet. And that's my goal, is to just continue growing that. So, you know, marketing, and I just started a Patreon this week, which has been going really well. So just trying to grow that community, and hopefully within the year, the listenership is much greater. And that's when the impact will really start to snowball, I think.
No, I totally agree. And I'm really happy to hear that it has grown so rapidly in the past, probably, 4 months, because it'll be one of those things, as it starts growing, hopefully it'll have that real snowballing effect, and you'll really get, because I mean, the thing is whether you agree or disagree with a lot of the things put forward in the show, it's challenging your perspectives on something, which is something I really like in the context of reptile keeping, because it makes you start thinking about what you're doing more, instead of, another, and I won't try and get into the tangent here just because we are wrapping up, but like, you are sold that set and forget mentality. Like you can get this pet, or you get this breeding project, and just become set and forget. And 12 months down the line, it breeds and you pull out the eggs and you've got money. And that's how so many people are sold it. And they never challenge exactly what you're saying. Like, they just fall into this paradigm until something forces them to change. Well, exactly. This is proactively getting you to think about what you're doing and how you can change it, which hopefully more people will get that mindset adopted into their keeping.
Yeah, no, that's the hope anyway.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Dillon, for coming on. It's been really, truly a pleasure talking to you. So if anyone's interested, Dillon's podcast is Animals at Home. And as he said, Bryce's complimentary podcast with it is Animals Everywhere. Just have a Google and you can find those. I'll also include them in the video when we put it up. And the other thing as well is, feel free to check out Dillon's YouTube. And you've also got other social medias. Do you want to give a plug for some of those?
Yeah, so if you just search Animals at Home on Instagram, it should come up. My actual handle is Animals at Home CA. And if you just search Animals at Home on Facebook as well, you'll find me.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Dillon. And we hope that, people got something, good out of this. Have a good one, everyone.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a blast. I really enjoyed that, and hopefully listeners enjoyed it as well.
No, I hope, well, I'm sure they will. I hope they do.